Earlier this week, upon learning that the lesson for today was the Joseph story, somebody asked me in the office if I would be singing selections from Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. The answer to that is no, mostly because nobody wants to hear me sing Andrew Lloyd Webber. If you get nothing else from this sermon, please get this. Through forgiveness, God works life even when we work death. We have moved in the narrative lectionary from the story of creation to Abraham and now to Joseph. The Joseph story takes up roughly about 40% of the material in Genesis, and so it's a long section of the book. We get here the beginning and its end, and there's a lot in the middle. But up to this point, humanity's record has not been all that good in the book of Genesis. After all, we began with eating that fruit we just weren't supposed to, and it all kind of went downhill from there. Especially the relationship between brothers. So right after the fruit is eaten, almost immediately afterwards in Genesis chapter 4, we didn't read this story, but it's there. Cain kills his brother Abel in the field. And a little bit later, Jacob, that is Joseph's father, steals his brother's birthright and blessing. You can see that this is the most dysfunctional family in human history. So up to this point, relationship between people and relationship between brothers doesn't have a good track record, and in fact, more often than not, leads to death and violence. And that brings us to the story of Joseph. If you haven't seen the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, the basic story is this. Jacob, whose other name is Israel, has 12 sons. Joseph is the second youngest, whose mother is Jacob's favorite wife, and so Joseph, being the oldest of his favorite wife, is naturally his favorite son. Now, Joseph doesn't help himself out at all here, right? Nobody likes favorites, but when you go up to your 10 older brothers and say to them, guess what? You're going to bow down before me. That doesn't work out too well for you. But that's exactly what Joseph does. He goes up to his older brothers and says, I had this dream, and in this dream you all were bowing down before me, even though I'm the 11th son and you all are bigger than me. And eventually Joseph's brothers get so tired of this act, so tired of this dreamer, so tired of this guy with his fancy coat. Eventually they get so tired that they resolve to kill him, like happened in Genesis a lot between brother and brother. Now, here comes Reuben, and Reuben says, don't kill him, but it's not because Reuben particularly likes Joseph. This is my favorite part, by the way. Reuben doesn't want to kill Joseph, not because he likes Joseph or because he thinks it's wrong to kill his brother, but he wants to have Joseph not die so that Reuben can then rescue him and present him to his father, and then be his father's favorite. Again, this is the most dysfunctional family in human history, right? And then Judah comes up, and Judah says, well, let's not kill him, let's just sell him into slavery, as if that's a better fate. And so Joseph goes to Egypt. I won't go into the rest of the story, but I think you know a lot of it. In Egypt, Joseph is discovered to be wise and have visions from God, and eventually becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. And because of a famine, the brothers have to go down to Egypt for food, and there they discover their long-lost brother. And after a few shenanigans along the way, and yes, I did say shenanigans in a sermon, after a few tricks along the way, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And they have a wonderful, touching moment, and Joseph says, invite the whole family, bring your wives and your children, and go get Dad and bring him to Egypt. And that's where the end of our story picks up. is that Jacob dies, and Joseph's brothers say to themselves, well, what if Joseph is really harboring a grudge, and this is like Michael Corleone at the end of Godfather 2, keep him alive only so long as Dad is alive, right? And so the brothers come up with this harebrained scheme. Dad said before he died, you should forgive us. And everybody falls down crying as soon as they realize how silly this is. Up to this very point, you would expect nothing but death from this story. You would expect Joseph to inflict his vengeance as soon as his father was dead. It's what happened with Cain and Abel. It's been happening the whole story through. Up to this point, this story has really been nothing more than a story of death, of brothers who sell their own brother into slavery, who then lie to their father. The work of people in this story has been just a lot of mess. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where you have worked such a mess, you have made so many mistakes that you can't expect anything more than more mess and more mistakes in your life? You've messed up so many times, things have gone wrong in so many different ways, you can't expect anything other than things to continue going wrong because of the mess you're in. That's where Joseph's brothers find themselves. And that's often the mess we find ourselves in, right? We've worked so many messes for ourselves in our everyday lives, whether it's our individual relationships or whether it's the big pressing problems of the age. The messes have gotten to be so many and so big that we can't expect anything than more disaster. But the great news is what Joseph said at the end here. After their brothers try this harebrained scheme, Joseph says to them, do not be afraid, for even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. The good news, the great news of the Joseph story is that even when people intend to work death and mess and disaster, even when it seems like that's all we can do, God intends to work something good. God intends to work new life. God intends to work resurrection, and God accomplishes that which he intends. And out of all this mess, death and resurrection are worked. And yet, that happens all because of this little thing called forgiveness. It is through forgiveness that Joseph offers this new life to his brothers. Something more than the sin that had been weighing them down all those years. And it is through forgiveness that God works new life and wholeness again in our lives. That's why we start with confession and forgiveness every Sunday. It's because we need to hear that God is working something new amidst all our mess. The psalm puts it this way: happy are those whose transgression is forgiven and whose sin is covered. Because what the psalmist goes on to say is that before that forgiveness, before that confession and forgiveness, it describes, while I kept in silence, my body wasted away through my groaning all the day long. That before forgiveness, there's this work of death in us, but then the psalmist can say, happy are those whose transgression is covered, because through forgiveness, God works new life in us. And so the only question I have for you is this: where is God working new life through forgiveness in you? Where is God working new life through forgiveness in you? You probably have some mess in your life that seems like it's such a big disaster, it can't bring anything other than more disaster and more mess. We call that my office. Maybe it's some relationship in your life that just seems so broken, so beyond repair, that can't bring anything other than more harm and more hurt. But God can work new life through forgiveness. Maybe it is some wound that seems like it will do nothing other than hurt, but God can bring new life through forgiveness. Maybe it's some person in your life who seems like they can do nothing but bring hurt and mess. But God can work new life through forgiveness. Because in the end, what Joseph says is true for all of us. What we intend for harm, God intends for good. Amen.